Welcome. I would like to give the first word to Kerstin Niblaeus, who is chairman of this Academy's International Committee.
Thank you. So it is my honor and pleasure to welcome you all here in the room and those who are with us on the screen to this webinar on global food safety and its scientific basis. I welcome, of course, especially Jennifer Clapp, who is, we are very proud to have as a newly elected fellow, international fellow of our Academy. Thank you so much for making the effort to come in person to Stockholm and for giving priority to our Academy in your agenda. And we look forward to many events and cooperation with you in the future. And Professor Clapp is not only an outstanding professor at the Waterloo University, but also vice chair of the high-level expert group, which provides scientific advice to the UN Committee of Food Security. This webinar is organized by two committees here at the Academy, the ones for international affairs and for research, and also by SIANI. Madeleine Voogd is the key person in making this happen. I would like to, if you will allow me, to say a few words about our Academy. We have a proud history of more than 200 years. In those days, Sweden was a very poor, war-ridden country, starving, without a leader. The king who failed in the wars was kicked out of the country, and a new king was recruited from France, one of the marshals of Napoleon's. Some expected him to continue the war and be more successful, but he was much wiser, and he said, now we will develop agriculture within the borders of Sweden. And he set up this academy to help him with that and to base this work on science and practical experience. He's there on the portrait in the middle. So in the beginning, this academy was like a combination of ministry, agriculture university, research council. But today we have a more modest role, and our ambition is to be an independent arena for discussions related to the green sectors, based on science and solid practical evidence. We have about 450 fellows, Swedish, and about 150 or more international fellows. Global food systems have been a priority the last few years. We were quite active in 2021 with the preparations of the summit, UN summit that year. And we helped our ministry to organize open dialogues. And we are very appreciative of the contacts we have with our ministry, and hope that that will continue. And we have several persons here who I would like to name who have been very active in this important work. It's Madeleine Voogd, of course, but also Cecilia Nordin van Gansberge and Andreas Stavlid and Christina Furustam, who are, some of you are here and some on link, I think. So with that, I think we can look forward to an extremely important and interesting afternoon. And I think Anders takes over. Thank you.
Thank you, Kerstin, for this short introduction of the Academy. I will be the moderator of this seminar today. And this is actually the first time I do it both in reality and on Zoom, so I'm a bit scared about the techniques. I will first give you advice on this. You see what it is? The microphones. And when they are green, you can talk. When they are red, you will not, anyone will not hear you. And we have also for the people sitting along the walls, separate microphones. So you will have them helped by Per running around with them. So I will say some few words about myself. I'm Anders Westfeldt. I'm also a fellow of this academy. I'm professor in human geography at Stockholm University, and my research focus is agriculture geography, both here in Sweden historically and globally. Kerstin already mentioned some of your backgrounds, Jennifer. But I will give you a short background. Professor Klapp's background is in economics, politics or world economics, international relations. She received her PC from London School of Economics 1992, and she holds since 2013 the Canadian Research Chair Professorship in Global Food Security and Sustainability at the School of Environment, Resources and Sustainability, University of Waterloo in Canada. And if you look into your publication, it is very extensive. The topics is global food regimes, financialization, global governance, environment, food security. I cannot describe all these things, but I actually created a snapshot with titles of books and papers. And I think the first book, and when I did this short list, I realized that one book will everyone in the room actually remember from this session. And that is this one, food. It's quite easy to remember that. So now you will go from this seminar and you remember at least one thing. We have other titles: corporate power in global agri-food governance, financialization, distance, and global food politics. That could actually be a geography topic. I think it is. Why equity is fundamental in climate change policy research. What I found interesting here is, from a social scientist, is that I think you are a unique social scientist in that way that you take on board a full global picture, both development problems in the developing world, but equally seeing the problem which comes with industrial agriculture in ongoing transformation processes in the developed world. And this is very few people who actually grasp this big thing. Today, you are going to talk about the challenge in making science-based policy recommendations for the global food systems. So I will stop there. I will say, beside the microphones, we also will have a question both from Zoom and from the room. The room is not a problem. I will check when we have the question section later on. But from Zoom, you need to actually write your questions in the chat. But we come to that later on. So now the floor is yours, Jennifer.
Okay, thank you very much, Anders, for that nice introduction. And I also want to thank Madeline Bogda for the invitation to speak on this topic, and also those at the KSLA who facilitated my visit. I'm really happy to be here and to speak with you today. So I, as mentioned, I'm speaking on the challenge of making science and knowledge-based policy recommendations for the global food system. And this is a really important moment to be speaking about this topic. As we all know, the world is currently in the grips of a world food crisis, where the number of people facing hunger and undernutrition is on the rise. And the cause of this crisis, as we know most immediately, we're very concerned about the war in Ukraine and how that's disrupted global supply chains. But even before the war, the outbreak of the war almost 1 year ago now, we were already very concerned about how the COVID-19 pandemic was affecting food security and nutrition globally. And At the same time, there was also a big concern about not meeting the not meeting the Sustainable Development Goal number 2 to end hunger and promote sustainable food security, which was really the impetus for the Food System Summit, which was already decided before the pandemic broke out that this would happen. And so all of this stuff has been going on in recent years with a lot of interest and concern about the global food security situation. And it's really the failure of the global community to really tackle hunger that has led to a growing conversation and interest in the role of science and knowledge in advising or informing policymaking for food security and nutrition, because clearly there's a sense that we're not bringing the right kinds of policies forward because we're not able to tackle these problems. So that's really what I want to address today, is this big question of how do we bring science and knowledge into the policymaking process to inform in ways that we need to move forward, because we all know from all ends of the political spectrum that a transformation of food systems is absolutely required. But at the same time, there's not always wide agreement on exactly how we go about doing that. So that's a bit of the challenge. And then my immediate challenge is which button I push to advance this. So there we go. So I've structured my remarks around 3 big questions. First, how can knowledge and science best support food security policy at the international level? Second, what is the experience of existing expert panels, such as the high-level panel of experts on food security and nutrition, in trying to support international food security policy development? And third, what are the current challenges facing the global food security policy context? Now, these are big questions, and I'm going to try and keep my comments as brief as possible. Otherwise, I'll be here till tomorrow still talking about these issues. So first, we'll go to the first question. How can knowledge and science best support food security policy? So as I already mentioned in the introduction, we are seeing a rise in world hunger. This is a graphic from the latest SOFI report, which is the State of Food Security in the World report that the FAO puts out every year. And as you can see, the trend, hunger trend line, and even the percentage of the world's population, it's been going up in recent years. So that's really a big concern. And in the past, there was typically an assumption that if we just produce more food, people will be well fed and will address this hunger problem. But we know we now produce more food than ever. Yet we still are seeing a hunger crisis. So we know that policies need to go beyond that kind of production-focused approach or that technology-focused approach, and we need to tackle this problem. But beyond just simply rising hunger in the world, we're seeing huge issues across food systems. So we know, I already mentioned, there's over 800 million chronically undernourished people. At the same time, there's 2.37 billion people facing moderate or severe food insecurity. So that's like, if you're not familiar with the difference between these two terms, chronic undernourishment really means you're not getting enough calories to even lead a basic sedentary life continuously for a year. That's how many people are facing that level of hunger. But a bigger number are facing what we call moderate or severe food insecurity, which is a broader category. But also over 3 billion people can't afford a healthy diet. Nearly 2 billion people are overnourished, and 1.5 billion people are facing one or more forms of micronutrient deficiency. And across the food system, we've got these broader issues and problems. We have a very uneven quality of food environments, meaning not everybody has access to healthy foods at all times. There are increasingly precarious food system livelihoods, especially for small-scale producers, especially in developing countries. Food systems have crossed what people call scientists call the planetary boundaries of what is sustainable, and food systems have crossed several of those boundaries. And food systems are increasingly vulnerable to climate change, as we all know. And then COVID-19 and the war in Ukraine have really exacerbated these trends. So the food system is facing broadly a number of challenges. And this really brings into focus why we need science and knowledge to inform policy. But I first want to talk about some of the challenges of bringing science and knowledge into policymaking. And it's important here to pause and talk about the fact that food systems themselves serve multiple functions in society, and that those multiple functions actually make policymaking extremely complex because there are a number of participants and stakeholders in food systems who have very different ideas of what food systems should be delivering. So we all know, these functions that food systems serve. Well, they all came in at once here, so I'll just talk about them. We know that food is a basic human need for survival. We know that access to adequate food is an internationally recognized human right. We know that food systems provide diverse types of livelihoods for around a third of humanity. They have a livelihood connected to food systems, although there's a huge diversity of livelihoods within food systems, from food system workers to small-scale producers to even large multinational corporations. They all are earning their livelihoods from food systems, but in very different ways. We know that food systems are deeply entrenched in ecosystems, and increasingly we're aware of the carbon emissions that arise from food systems, but also the damage that industrial agriculture has posed for biodiversity, water, etc. And we know that food is a cornerstone of cultural norms and practices all over the world and in different ways. And finally, food is obviously a market commodity. As we see more and more people living in cities, they're relying on markets primarily to buy food, but it's not just that it's a consumer product. It also is a commodity in the sense that food is increasingly seen as a financial asset, where financial actors are investing in food systems in different ways, or in commodity futures products as almost like a currency. So food is serving all kinds of functions for all different kinds of participants and stakeholders within food systems. But that is what, in a way, makes it so challenging to bring science and knowledge into the process, because there are different interests involved. And we know that there are vast power differentials within food systems, and some actors have more voice than others. So small-scale producers producing on marginalized lands who might be facing hunger, they have less voice within the policymaking process than large commercial interests do, for example. So in that sense, it's really important to make sure that science and knowledge that comes to bear on food policymaking is legitimate. It's viewed as legitimate by all participants in food systems. So that's the big challenge. And when I mentioned these different power dynamics within food systems, and some voices being louder than others, just to give a call out to a report that's about to come out this next week from IPES Food, which is another expert panel, non-governmental expert panel that I sit on, which is focused on countering the corporate capture of food systems governance. It's really pointing out that there are both visible ways in which big corporate actors engage in food governance and shape it through multi-stakeholder initiatives or public-private partnerships, et cetera. But they're also engaged in ways that are less visible, such as political donations and sponsoring research, and et cetera. So when you've got this kind of big set of powerful actors that have a big stake in what food system governance looks like, it's really important for science and knowledge to be aware of those powerful actors, how they operate, to make sure that science and policy carries that kind of legitimacy and balance that is accepted by all stakeholders. So that's where this question of legitimacy comes in. And I just want to point out a paper that I was lead on, came out a couple of weeks ago in Nature Food, where we identify the principles that are necessary to make science and knowledge for policymaking in the food space more legitimate. And to do that requires science and policy bodies, such as the high-level panel of experts that I sit on, or any other science policy body, need to have processes and procedures in place that ensure that the work that comes forward from those bodies is widely accepted and seen as legitimate. So that's what we call the I-TRACE principles. And I'm going to go into these a little bit more depth in the next slide. So that first, the I stands for independent. And it's really important that science policy bodies for food systems are clear that they're independent from the kind of interest groups in food systems, including states, but including, as I said, big, powerful actors. And they need to be sure that that independence allows them to serve the public interest. not any specific interests of any of those groups with different stakeholders, but really the public interest. And what is the public interest? I mean, we know we have these goals that are agreed, the 2030 agenda to end hunger, promote sustainable food systems. These are goals in the public interest, and the independence is really important of science policy to serve that public interest. And independence is also necessary to ensure a balanced assessment of evidence that comes from different sources. So that balance is very important. In a sense, it's requiring that assessment and not just necessarily giving equal time to, the voices of different players, but really assessing the evidence against the goals, the public interest goals. And the experts that are involved should be free from conflicts of interest. In other words, not coming from any one of those stakeholder groups and speaking for them, but really speaking on behalf of the public interest. So that's really important, is the independence of this kind of science and knowledge. It also needs to be transparent. And this means open processes where it's very clear how the science body, for example, operates and follows transparent processes, and also to acknowledge where debates and disagreements exist. So in other words, it's important that when we know that food systems serve so many different functions, there are bound to be differences of opinion about different kinds of policy ideas. It's important to acknowledge that those disagreements exist rather than trying to paper over them and assume that we're always going to agree on everything, because it's very unlikely. I've been studying food systems for 30 years. There's a lot of disagreements. So it's important to acknowledge where those exist and should talk about pros and cons of different kinds of policy solutions. And also providing clarity on how different inputs are considered. And that's really important, rather than just saying, oh, we'll take all submissions and then coming out with some kind of policy advice. It's important to actually be accountable. A science policy body has to say how that advice was taken into consideration and whether it was taken up or not and why. So again, that kind of transparency is really important. It also needs to be accessible. I mean, we know that scientists can often speak in jargon and in tongues that people, average people don't understand. Policymakers need to have information readily accessible and available that is not going to require them to go and take a university course just to understand what the policy advice is. It needs to be clear. And so this, again, is really important for legitimacy, because it helps to make clear what the assumptions are behind policy advice and how it might be implemented and what are the expected outcomes. That kind of accessibility is very, very important to draw those clear linkages. And also the information that goes into these assessments needs to be adhering to the principles of open and fair access. And there's a big movement now about data openness and data access, just to make sure that everyone has access to the information and can assess it on their own. And that provides, again, it builds legitimacy through the processes of science policy for food systems. And this is a big one, is the C, is the consultative. It's extremely important for any science advice that goes into policymaking to consult with experts from a range of sources. And I use the words knowledge and expertise explicitly rather than science, because there are a lot of experts in food systems who are not, quote unquote, scientists, right? Farmers, producers, food system workers, they all have expertise from where they sit within food systems, and their knowledge and information is extremely important for policymakers to understand. And they're also knowledge holders, Indigenous peoples. We know that we need to understand traditional knowledge, Indigenous knowledge, and it's very important for food systems, and it needs to be brought into the process. So while you can study academic papers that are published in scientific journals, you need to supplement that and really bring it together with expertise coming from other knowledge holders. And that's really important. And also, it's important to consult with those who are most affected by hunger and undernutrition, because we need to understand, those are the participants in food systems who are often having the least voice, as I mentioned. So we need to understand their lived experience and bring it into understandings of how food systems work and what kinds of policies can lead to improvements. Because it's not that helpful just to have this scientific understanding without any connection to the on the ground experiences of people, because then you risk making policy advice that bears no relationship to their outcomes and their lived experience. So that's really important, is to have that consultative process. And I would say that actually adds a lot of time and effort into science policymaking, but it's extremely important to include. And then finally, obviously, evidence-based, like science and knowledge that advises for policy needs to be based on evidence. I've already mentioned the importance of lived experience, but also I would say the range of scientific evidence coming from a range of disciplines. So what's really interesting and unique about food systems is how many different disciplines are probably represented even in this room and in the KSLA, from economics to agrarian studies, to agronomy, to nutrition, geography, sociology. There's so many disciplines, political science, that all of us are studying in a way, interdisciplinary way, and have to interact with each other. And I really think that it's important that the science and knowledge for policymaking tap into all of these different disciplines and all of these different communities. But even there's opportunity and there's lots of disagreement, coming from different academic camps about what is the best way forward. An economist might say, oh, it's an economic problem, right? And a nutritionist might say, it's a food quality problem. And so it's really important to bring in all those voices and understand how to bring them together in a way that makes for coherent policy advice. And so it's obviously a very complex process, but if we don't bring in all of these elements into that process, there's a risk that scientific advice or science and knowledge advice lacks legitimacy. And that's the last thing we want, because if you've got a policy that just sort of gets railroaded through really quickly without going through these kinds of consultative processes, there could be a lot of people who are very skeptical of it, and that can obviously cause problems, and the policy itself might cause problems because it wasn't consulting with those who are most affected. So these principles are very, very important to ensure legitimacy of the advice and the soundness of the advice. So I want to shift now to talk a little bit about the experience of the high-level panel of experts on food security and nutrition, which is the science policy body of the Committee on World Food Security. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with the ecosystem of the UN Committee on World Food Security, but it's a UN body. It's been around since the 1970s. And at the moment, it has both member governments as well as non-governmental participants in the process. That includes civil society and the private sector, in a kind of process that's trying to build international policy consensus and policy products to coordinate on food security issues at the international level. And so the high-level panel of experts is an expert body that advises this UN committee. Now I'm going to show a slide that's really complicated and you probably can't read it, as but I'm going to zoom in on parts of this. But I wanted to share this because when I joined the high-level panel of experts on food security and nutrition several years ago, I was trying to wrap my head around how do all these different things that I hear about relate to each other. And so the things in green are the Committee on World Food Security. The things in blue are the processes of the high-level panel of experts. The things in yellow are sort of the Rome-based agencies. That's the FAO, the World Food Program, and the IFAD. The thing in orange, that's the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food. And the purple box, that's like the UN system. So all of these elements are part of the food security governance process in the UN level, but they all have their different roles and functions. And I want to zoom in a little bit on both the CFS and the high-level panels, just to explain how they work and what they do in trying to build policy convergence around food security issues at the international level. So this is the CFS, what it sort of looks like, at least in my head. And its aim is to, as I said, build policy coordination. So it negotiates guidelines and other policy products often based on high-level panel of expert reports. It adopts policy recommendations, and it does a periodic review of the implementation of the policy recommendations and guidelines. And that's sort of its function, is to meet regularly. It meets in October every year for the annual plenary, and meets the Bureau and Advisory meets periodically throughout the year to discuss food security issues. And the committee itself, as I mentioned, it was established in the 1970s, and it has these what's unique about it in the UN system is it has these mechanisms that allow for participation from civil society and indigenous peoples, so they have their own mechanism, and private sector has its own mechanism, and the governments themselves are the voting members. So the CSIPM and the PSM are allowed to sort of be at the meetings, they're allowed to speak, they have inputs into the process, but they don't vote. States are the ones who vote because it's this UN body, but it's unique in that it allows this non-state participation, and that's recognition that there's expertise and knowledge that's coming from these other constituencies. It's not, and it ensures that this body isn't just about state interests, but I'm going to come back to that point because state interests certainly come into the process. And the reform of the CFS, there was a big reform in 2009 after the 2008 food crisis, where there was maybe a sense that the CFS, which was established actually out of the 1970s food crisis, there was this idea that we need this policy coordination mechanism. It was set up at that first World Food Conference, but it didn't have civil society and private sector participation at that time. And it was kind of criticized as a bit of a talk shop. There was actually some concern about the CFS, and maybe it should even be shut down because governments would talk past each other and they would talk, and nothing would really happen. And so there was a big reform in 2009 after the last food crisis, really trying to sort of jolt this body back into working in a more constructive way. And it was really successful in that sense of bringing in civil society and the private sector into a more robust conversation. I think the CFS has really gained a lot of legitimacy by doing that, and people feel good about its products, but of course some challenges remain, and I'll come back to that. But in 2009, the high-level panel of experts on food security and nutrition was created as part of this reform process, really to make sure that an evidence-based, science and knowledge-based set of advice was coming to members of the CFS, so that it wasn't just a talk shop about interests, that it actually had substance coming from the scientific and knowledge communities to inform what happens in that space. So that was exciting that the high-level panel of experts in food security and nutrition was formulated at that time, and made sense because other bodies were also, we all know about the IPCC, right? It's a scientific body that provides advice to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, or the IPBES, which was also coming into place around, I can't remember what year it actually came into being, but sometime in the last decade, bringing advice forward on biodiversity issues, just for example. So the HLPE is kind of in that vein. So this is a slight, as much as I could zoom in on the HLPE and what it does, but I just wanted to sort of flag some key aspects. So I already mentioned when it was set up, the HLP, it really tries to provide that independent evidence-based policy. Its secretariat is hosted at the FAO, and it really strives to provide this kind of expert advice, and does so through what we call the steering committee. So there's a 15-member panel of the steering committee, and the steering committee, though, is not the whole HLP. It's not like there's only 15 people on this high-level panel. It's just the steering committee, and it makes sure that reports are regularly undertaken in consultation with the CFS. It works on the policy recommendations, addressing critical issues like COVID-19 or the war in Ukraine, this sort of thing. And then what's interesting is that its substantive reports are actually written by what we call project teams for HLPE reports. So it's not that, we're doing a report right now on inequalities, and it's not that the 15 people on the panel are writing that report. We find experts from all over the world who are experts specifically in inequality, and they get together and work on the report. And then they work with the steering committee to produce the final report. So it sort of brings in these additional experts who are part of that expert panel. And of course, the project teams are drawing on a range of data sources that come from, the vast troves of statistical knowledge and information that the FAO and other Rome-based agencies produced, as well as other kinds of expert bodies drawing on the latest scientific and scholarly studies, and also inputs from open consultations with stakeholders. And it follows these really important review processes as well. This is, again, important for legitimacy. It goes through extensive peer review, all of the reports, but also a really important part of these open and transparent consultation processes. So all the reports at all the stages, the V0 draft, the V1 draft, the V2 draft, it's being reviewed. And at that V1 draft is where we really have the open and transparent consultation we've got a roster of over 1,200 experts and other kinds of participants, indigenous knowledge holders, and farmer communities and organizations that provide in-depth, detailed advice and inputs into all the reports. So it's really a consultative process. So I want to stress about the iTrace principles that I've already mentioned. HLP is very independent, although it still is quite tethered to the CFS. It's transparent in terms of its processes. It's accessible, consultative, and evidence-based. So it meets these kinds of criteria, but of course there are always ways that it can be improved. But these are the processes, but also equally important is the content. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the work that HLPE has done. And recently, for example, we did a big report in 2020, kind of looking at why the global community is not meeting SDG 2, and we produced the report, Food Security and Nutrition, Building a Global Narrative Towards 2030. This was a request from the Committee on World Food Security to do a big picture look at the progress that's happening and what can policy and scientific advice bring forward. And one of the main recommendations of this report was to widen the way we view food security. Traditionally, the last few decades, we've talked about 4 pillars of food security. You're probably familiar with them, being availability, access, utilization, and stability. These have been sort of the standard dimensions of food security that we've talked about, and they've really informed policy in important ways. So availability obviously means that there's enough food. Access means people are able to access it. So it's, there could be food in the community, but people don't have money to buy it. So you need to make sure there's access. Utilization is referring to the nutritional component, that the human body is able to take that food and metabolize it properly. And stability, meaning that global markets are not, volatile, et cetera. And so what this report advised is that we need to move to a wider framework. If I can get this to move, which we call the 6 dimensions of food security. So here we added sustainability and agency. And what we're referring to here, obviously by sustainability, there's a growing recognition that we're not going to have food security and nutrition into the future unless it's sustainable today and sustainable into the future. And so in that sense, sustainability needs to be internalized into our understanding of food security itself. And that's extremely important. And we know that we're often talking about, how food systems need to be sustainable. That's a big reason why we're pushing this transformative agenda. So sustainability is essential. And now agency is another element that we really recommended be brought in. And sometimes people are confused what we need by agency. Agency is simply referring to people's voice and ability to participate in food systems on their own terms. So it's really trying to recognize that there are a lot of people who might be poor, underrepresented in their communities. They might be marginalized within food systems. They need to have more of a say in how food systems operate and also how they're governed. And that kind of agency can really help ensure better food security and nutrition in the long run. And all of these dimensions are interrelated with one another. And this, just to say, this idea is not necessarily it's not embraced by all of CFS. CFS did not pass a policy recommendation saying, yeah, good idea. Some states are really excited about it. Others are a little more skeptical for various reasons. But what's interesting to us is that since we published this report, the FAO is now using this in their State of Food Insecurity reports every year, and they're finding this a useful framework. It's also been picked up in lots of academic research studies. So perhaps it will one day be embraced by the CFS membership. We will see. And another substantive recommendation out of this report was the need to shift policy along a number of axes to better address food security and nutrition problems. One being moving from just a focus on supply, as I mentioned, to more of a radical transformation of food systems as a whole. And that's really embracing those 6 dimensions. Moving away from seeing food security and nutrition as just being a sectoral issue. It's not just an agricultural issue or just even a food system issue. Food systems are interconnected with ecological systems, economic systems, health systems. I mean, the pandemic really made this evident, and we're really trying to widen that agenda to really see how these internet connections happen. Also, a move from just focusing on hunger and undernutrition to understanding the complex dynamics of malnutrition in all its forms and the interrelationships. And also, increasingly, we need to understand that there's not going to be one solution to the global hunger problem. It needs to be context-specific policies that happen on the ground in different places to take into account different contexts. There are lots of countries in the world, for example, facing complex conflicts and crises that have to think about food policies in a different way from countries that might not be facing those circumstances. And so we need to have diverse policies. So that's some of the substantive advice coming out of the high-level panel. And also just to briefly mention, some examples of the way in which the reports coming out of the HLPE inform Committee on World Food Security outputs. So for example, the HLP did a big report in 2017 on nutrition and food systems that resulted in a voluntary guidelines on food systems and nutrition just this past year. So the policy process can take a long time, lots of negotiations that go on among governments, but behind it is usually a high-level panel of experts report. Same with agroecology. There's now policy recommendations coming out of the CFS this past year on agroecology and implementing agroecology. And that was supported by an HLPE report on agroecology, which was really important in establishing the 13 principles of agroecology that are now widely recognized in lots of different scientific reports. So these are just some examples of the ways in which the science policy body then informs international food policies. Okay, I'm coming to the final section of what I wanted to talk about, which were some of the current challenges facing global food security and the policy context in particular at this moment. This is a picture from CFS 50, which was Rome in October. And you can see the CFS chair on the screen here, Gabriel Ferraro di Loma, and he's looking a little frustrated, partly because the conversations are a little bit frustrating. And I'll explain a little bit why they're a little bit frustrating. Let me find myself in my notes here. Okay, so I just want to stress that just because you've got, we might have a science policy body and it might have really good processes to ensure the legitimacy of the advice, and they might bring really good content forward to consider on improving food security policies, but it doesn't mean that governments are necessarily going to listen. Right? I mean, it's a basic political point, but it's important to recognize. And I say that because there's been some critique of the science policy space right now, some critique even of the HLPE because the CFS looks maybe weak in the face of big crises. It's not making decisions. But that I would say it's not necessarily the fault of the science. It's about politics. And the same thing is happening in the space of climate change. So we know, there's the big COP27, but a lot of the ambition fell short of what the scientists were hoping for in that context. Same with a CBD conference on biodiversity that happened in Montreal in December. There was a lot of critique that governments were making only small commitments rather than the big ones that were coming from the science bodies that they wanted to see big changes. The same thing is going on here in the space of food security. So what is that, what is the source of that? Well, I would say state interests and geopolitics still matter a lot. I would say that at this moment, the war in Ukraine has really complicated international food policy coordination. I mean, the pandemic, it was bad enough. There was a lot of push for coordinated policies in the wake of the pandemic, still going on. But even there, it was difficult to get governments to agree on a specific set of measures to respond to the pandemic. Getting them to agree on a specific set of measures responding to the supply chain disruptions caused by the war is even more difficult. And so the tensions that we're seeing geopolitically more broadly in the world about the war in Ukraine are really mirrored within the CFS itself. And that led to some really, I would say difficult conversations that happened in the CFS, even the deliberations. The first day of the CFS meeting, so that's the plenary that usually lasts 4 days in Rome in October. The first day is usually really straightforward, where you've got high-level policymakers coming and talking about the latest FAO reports and hunger numbers, and then then they can move on to the other business, but they acknowledge that there's a bad situation. Well, this day of discussion was difficult, but CFS couldn't even agree on the fourth day how to summarize the conversation. That's how difficult the conversation was. So they had to reconvene in December virtually just to agree on language of how they summarized what the discussion was. So you can imagine what the discussion was, but I'll tell you in a nutshell. You had some governments, obviously Ukraine, the EU, US, saying that the main reason we're seeing a spike in hunger right now is because of the war in Ukraine and the disrupted supply chains. That's what's the main problem right now. And then on the other hand, you've got Russia, Belarus, and some other countries saying, no, it's sanctions. Sanctions is the biggest problem. It's not the war. It's the fact that the West has put sanctions in place. And this sort of went back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And that's why they couldn't agree on the language, because some parties wanted the word sanctions to be in the agreed text and others did not. And in fact, when they reconvened in December, first time ever, CFS actually had to do a roll call vote on this issue. And of course, Russia and Belarus didn't win that, but I think they got a footnote in the end. But it was just like one of these processes where it was kind of tedious and frustrating to watch, because the substantive issues about hunger and undernutrition, and even some of the big structural issues of why, what is wrong with food systems right now and why is it so difficult to tackle hunger, those weren't even discussed. It just sort of devolved into this geopolitical discussion, and that was rather frustrating. And in the midst of this, the high-level panel of experts, I've got up here the cover of a report we were able to produce in April about the immediate impact of the war on hunger and nutrition in the world. But we were not able to update that or move forward with it because of that deadlock within the CFS. And we respond to requests from the CFS. So they did not request an update from us. So that report's there. It's a really good report. We wish we could update it. I mean, and I've had the privilege to be able to work through other expert groups like the International Panel of Experts on Sustainable Food Systems to analyze the impacts of the war. And so those reports came out in May and June, and done a lot of media interviews, et cetera, to sort of get that analysis out, but not through these official channels. So I would say that's a huge issue and a challenge. Another thing I wanted to bring up is the UN Food Systems Summit, which took place in 2021, but there was a lot of process the year before, a lot of consultations online. Because it was during the pandemic, it was kind of weird that a lot of this stuff was virtually occurring. But it also caused a lot of confusion around, which bodies in the UN are most responsible for dealing with food security and nutrition anyway? There was a big sense, especially among civil society, that the CFS was being sort of sidestepped, and that suddenly we had this new food system summit process. A big contingent of civil society walked out and boycotted the summit because they were worried that it was over representing corporations and not truly engaging with the civil society and social movements that they felt that they represented. And so it created this big fissure and confusion. And in the midst of this, there was also this push from some in the scientific group of the summit, because they had their own science group, proliferation of these science groups, that were calling for a new science policy body, which they called an IPCC for food, but they weren't always acknowledging the existence of the HLPE, and that might have been critique of the CFS process. We're not really sure, but it created a lot of confusion and a lot of debate at the time. And so that, I think, is a challenge because there's still this discussion going on about the role of the summit, et cetera. But in the next slide, I'll show that one of the things that came out of that summit was an acknowledgement that we don't need to create any new institutions. We have a lot of institutions. We have the FAO and IFAD and the World Food Program, it's CFS, but let's coordinate better among them. And bringing in other institutions like UNEP and UNDP, et cetera, into the process. And so there was a creation of what's called now the UN Food Systems Coordination Hub. Their website launched a couple of weeks ago, even though it officially existed as of January 1st, 2022. And this new hub has also established a new scientific advisory committee that is bringing in members of the HLPE-FSN, as well as members from the UN Food System Summit Scientific Group, as well as some other scientists. And it's a group of 33 scientists advising governments on moving forward. But the work hasn't commenced yet. And so I can't say a lot about what the process is going to look like because I only just got the letter 2 days ago telling me the first meeting is going to happen virtually in February. But it's certainly an interesting time that, you know, these kinds of things are moving and happening, but we have yet to see if it's going to result in any substantively different kinds of advice and how, and also, as I said, just because advice might be sound and legitimate doesn't mean that governments are going to pick it up again. And part of that has, as I said, interest, and it's not just those geopolitics I talked about. Underlying all of that too are obviously trade interests, right? So some governments are really focused on grain exports, for example. Others might be, you know, dependent on food imports, and the trade issue is really, really important as well as an undercurrent within the politics of these kinds of food security policymaking bodies. And then in the meantime, just quickly state, there's been some movement towards collaboration or at least cooperation amongst different science policy bodies that touch on food security issues. So obviously I've talked a lot about the HLPE-FSN, but the IPBES, which is the International Panel on Biodiversity, is it Ecosystem Services? I should know this off the top of my head. And the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. We've had initial discussions between the leadership of these different bodies. And it's interesting, if you take some specific issues like agroecology, like all three of these bodies have made recommendations about the importance of agroecology for protecting biodiversity, for addressing climate change, and for food security. So there are areas where there's potential for policy convergence advice, but the uptake among governments has been much more patchy, let's say. So quickly summing up, just to say, I think there's really diverse roles and power differentials in food systems that require us to design science, policy, and society interfaces in ways that ensure legitimacy. And I would say the HLPE does have unique legitimacy because it follows a lot of those key principles that feed into the policy convergence process, but challenges obviously remain in these spaces. And as I said, design of these bodies matters, but so do interests and geopolitics. So with that, I'm sorry if I spoke for too long, but I will say thank you for listening. I look forward to this.
Oh, thank you, Jennifer. And I think everyone has questions, but I think we keep the questions to the question session, which is after this 4 short presentation, where we start with Dr. Matilda Barajbar.
Yes, thank you for inviting me. It's an honor to be here today and to listen to Jennifer Clapp. It was a very fascinating talk also to hear a little bit about how these discussions and in situ. I was asked to talk a little bit about the challenges of the global food system, which is of course very close to the things that Jennifer already talks about. So I will be very brief and try to be a little bit in dialogue with her. I'm a researcher and lecturer at the Department of Economic History, International Relations in Stockholm University. And I'm also member of the advisory board of the South American Institute for Resilience and Sustainability Studies. And I work with a historically informed political economy, I'd say, about agrarian change and agri-food systems. Oh, yes. You touched upon this. Food is different. Even though, as Jennifer said, it's often traded as any other commodity, it's not. And most people in the world kind of intuitively realize that access to food is a basic human right, a moral duty even. And as Jennifer mentioned, this was already in the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, established this right to adequate food. And this has also been implemented in legally binding agreements in international law that most of the states in the world have ratified. And of course, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development also recognizes that the realization of the right to adequate food is both an achievable goal and the way ahead. And yet, as Jennifer also mentioned, hunger, food insecurity, and malnutrition are not only persisting, but actually increasing. And this is from the latest FAO report. There are, of course, as Jennifer said, many ways of measuring and different metrics, but everybody kind of agree that the world is moving backwards in its efforts to end hunger. And this is, of course, as Jennifer also mentioned, we have this particular circumstances right now of the COVID-19 pandemic, reducing incomes, disrupted supply chains, and so on, and the impact of the war of Ukraine. We have the price hikes, but also the inflation, of course. So people are losing real income, and it's expected that millions of additional people will move into acute food insecurity. But as I mentioned, this is not new, but as economic historian, I think it's important to take also a longer historical perspective on this. And I think it's important to bear in mind that there's been, of course, a very important increase in world food supply. Modern agriculture basically is based on boosting supply at low cost. And in the last 2 centuries, world agriculture succeeded in producing enough food to provide more per capita food than ever before, in spite of an almost 7-fold increase in population. So this is from Giovanni Federico, The Economic History of Agriculture, part of McNeill and Pomeranz, The Cambridge World History. And we can see that during the second half of the 20th century, we can see that both kind of numbers of humans and food grew in an unprecedented pace, but yet food supplies increased faster. So to be more precise, between 1950 and 2000, world agrarian production grew by an average of 2.3% yearly, more than tripled during this period, while the world population more than doubled. And we also know, and we will come back to this, that this is based on a model of high input, high output, which have, of course, a lot of environmental concerns, as Jennifer mentioned. And it's also, it's undeniable that this output has raised at a very cheap price, at least cheap market price. But then we have the discussion of the externalization of different kind of both environmental and social costs. But I guess what I want to say here is that the problem of hunger, as Jennifer said also, is not one of world supply, as we know, but of distribution. And this becomes perhaps particularly clear when we think about the kind of contradictions of the world food system. It's estimated, it varies a little bit, but around 1/3 of all produced food is wasted. And there are, of course, different dynamics in producer ends and consumption kind of commodity chains, but this is related, of course, to the kind of price relations, and in the richer world, labor costs in relation to the very low cost of food, at least in a historical sense. And then another staggering contradiction, perhaps, of today's global food order is the current obesity crisis. Actually, there are more people dying from health issues related to this condition than from lack of food. And healthy food, as we know, is much more expensive than crap food and empty calories. And another part of this contradiction, I would say, is the process of meatification. So we have this contemporary world of hunger. At the same time, the bulk of vegetable protein available for human nutrition, for example, soy and corn, is actually used mainly for animal feed. And this is quite absurd. I mean, it's a huge protein conversion loss. It's also depending on different estimation and different types of meat. But when we talk about this conversion into beef cattle, we're losing 90% of the value of feed when we feed it to beef cattle. And this is, I think, quite interesting also in many of these kind of FAO reports and so on. This is rather naturalized, this kind of meatification process, and in estimations, it's taken for granted that meat consumption will increase, basically, and on par with increases on income, which is, of course, is a strong empirical connection there, but it's not, I think it's not necessary to naturalize it. Yeah, and this is, of course, linked, at least, I mean, since also this animal production, I mean, all agriculture, but perhaps animal production particularly is very much linked to the, deforestation and the severe environmental degradation, but the whole agri-food system, as Jennifer also mentioned, and perhaps linked to, even though kind of the supply shock came after Second World War, it was actually in the period between 1870 to the Second World War that all these kind of transformations within the, at least Western farming system, went from this kind of organic circular economies based on on-farm inputs towards these industrial systems, high input, high output, as I said, and increasing use of these inputs. And it's this kind of industrial type of agriculture then exported to the rest of the world. And that's also something I find interesting if you look at a lot of land reports today and so on, even though there is a kind of a consensus, both in kind of scientific community and in the governance community of the kind of externalities that this is bringing, you can see that this is still what we are pushing for, and it's still moving in this direction. Despite we all kind of know these costs. And then, of course, this is an old picture, but it's just to say that these things, social and environmental factors, are, as also Jennifer mentioned, highly interlinked. But I just, and it's also, the areas with the highest food insecurity are the areas that are expected to have the most severe impacts on climate change, and also the same areas often that are expected to have the biggest growth of population. But still, as I said, at this moment at least, perhaps future supply is another question, because we also have a shrinking agriculture frontier, not much frontier left. But at this moment, the problem is not in the first place a supply problem. So I think it seems quite clear to end hunger, for example, and to fulfill this promise of the right to food. Political will is needed. And Jennifer talked a lot about this state tensions between different states and their interests, also perhaps depending if they are net importers or net exporters and so on. And you also touched upon that, but I think, basically, to be a little bit blunt here, but allocating food along the lines of the markets in a very uneven world, and as we know, increasingly so, will never end hunger. And I also think that the system that in the first hand is driven by this very giant agribusiness actors, as we know, because it's also one of the most concentrated markets in the world, with this huge concentration, even though, of course, states can regulate stricter, they do and they should have stricter environmental regulations and so on. I think it's important to at least have in mind that these actors will always try to externalize costs and will perhaps stricter regulations and new technologies is perhaps part of the solution, but perhaps not the whole solution. We have to redesign, I would say, as an economic historian, the incentives of the whole economic system that the food system is, of course, part of. And even though, I mean, I kind of see the problem before we had in these kind of governance arenas, international governance arenas, very centered on government, as you said, Jennifer, and they have been kind of opening up to new sectors, and it's kind of the NGOs, the civil society, but also the private sectors. And of course, you're the expert of this here, but seeing it from the outside, it seems a little bit, I mean, the big corporations are increasingly invited in all these policy arenas, and it seems a little bit hard to believe that a kind of radical transformation that would kind of attempt their or be a hindrance to their profits would ever come out of an arena where they're such an integrated part. So that's something to think about, and thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Matilda. And now we continue with a presentation from Professor Sofia Bokvist. It's from Swedish University of Agricultural Science.
Thank you very much for the introduction. It's very nice to be here and nice to see that so many are joining online as well. So my name is Sofia Bokvist, and the title of my presentation is Translating Science into Policy in a Development Context. And it's very interesting to listen to Professor Clapp's presentation about policies on a national level and how it works on that kind of level. So I will present this program called Agri4C, Agriculture for Food Security, of which I am the program director. And we work more on the ground, so to say, in the local context. So we try to work with policies as a way of trickling up instead of trickling down. So this program is funded by SIDA and started in 2016. And there is a consortium of 4 Swedish academic parties and universities, SLU, Lund University, Stockholm Environment Institute, and Linköping University. And of course, we work very closely together with partners, mainly academic institutes and universities in Sub-Saharan Africa and in South and Southeast Asia. So the aim with this program is really to synthesize and translate existing science into policy and practice, and to develop capacity to do so. So even though there are universities within this consortium and we work together with universities and academic institutes, we do not produce research, we do not produce scientific data, but really focuses on how to make best use of this scientific data, as Professor Clapp emphasized in her presentation. How can we support these translation processes to improve policies on local level, regional level, national level mainly, but perhaps also on international level, depending on what happens. And thereby, we believe we will contribute to the 3 points you see here, to nutrition, food security, improved livelihoods, and also increased sustainable smallholder agricultural production and productivity. And we all know today that about 80% of the food that is being consumed today is produced by smallholders. So this program really focuses on how to improve the conditions at the smallholder level, how to increase profitability for these smallholder farmers in Africa and in Asia. And there is a need to transform the agricultural system, which this seminar is all about. And it's been emphasized that these processes are complex and need to be based on best available science and tailored to country-specific conditions. And that is really the focus on this program. So this program, we target the interface, practice, science and policies. You can say that we have sort of two interconnected pathways. We can't look at them separately, but we look at them together, so to say. So one is to strengthen research institutional capacities in research translation. Many of us who have worked together with parties in Africa and Asia, we know that many of these universities, they are very heavy in teaching and do not have much means for doing research, but they have the scientific knowledge, they have the evidence, and they know how to contribute to improve policies and practices also. So we work closely together with these universities, trainings, capacity building, longer mentoring program where we try to encourage the younger researchers to take part in these processes. And we have a few universities that we work extra closely together with, and now we're in the process of migrating course curriculum in translating science into policy and practice, and also how to do systematic reviews, which is very, very important to identify gaps and to see what's been done before. And together with that, we also support what we call change projects. We do not call them research projects because they are not, but they use the science that is available. And currently we have, I think, 17 different change projects in Africa and Asia. You know, it's quite many, 17, and they're not very big, perhaps 1 to 3 years with a quite limited budget. But by engaging these researchers, you know, it's opened up really their commitment, and then engagement has made it possible to create changes on the ground within a quite small time frame. And I will come back to that later on and give you one example of that. Let's see. I push and push. Okay. So the ambition with this program is, let's see if it works. I'm sorry, I think I pushed the right, yeah. Okay. Is to increase capacity of scientists to synthesize, analyze, and communicate science with different stakeholders through training, capacity building, and other activities, and also try to improve connection between science, policy, and practice, using different networks, creating a platform where all these actors can meet. And we always try to include, or we have to include, people on the ground, so to say, the local stakeholders and the policymakers. And by this, we believe we can contribute with increased use of science-based knowledge in policies. Okay, give me one more try, see if it works better. So this program, we have developed a working model that we call the Agri4C 2030 working model. It's based on a theory of change. I will come back to that later. But this is like an overview of how we work. You know, I'm a researcher myself. I do research in food safety. So I belong to the bubble to the left, the science. I'm an expert in writing grants, applying for funding. Often they do not fund it. Sometimes they do. It's a hard word. We produce scientific results. We publish it. And then some of us engage in the process of how to push these results further, how to make best use of them. Otherwise, I think most often we tick the box, we have done our publications, and then we go to the next. But the DNA of the Agri4C program, where the translation action takes place, that's in this triangle in the middle, where the researchers meet the stakeholders. So in everything we do, we really early in the processes identify who are the key stakeholders that the researchers should work together with. And that's done by the researchers themselves in the communities in which we work with. And then with a thorough support with communication and engagement. And for this quite simple model, we managed to sort of push the science-based data as far as possible to the right in this picture, to the policy track or the practices, thereby contributing to SDG 2 and also to other relevant SDGs. So we have developed what is called a theory of change model on different levels in this program. On the program level, which I represent, but also on the middle level, and then on the project level, on these different projects I exemplified. So here you just see the different outputs, the outcomes, and what we hope is the impact of the program. And now, it's quite easy, relatively easy to do the outputs. We do the exchanges, courses, workshops, create meeting arenas and so forth. And the next step where we're in now is more the outcomes to increase the capacities of the scientists and to increase the use of science-based knowledge. And then you see the box to the left, to the right, the program impact. That can take like 5-10 years, even more than that. But we see in some of the projects we support, we're actually there. We can see seed of change. We can see that situation has actually changed on the ground, and even in some cases trickle up to ministry levels. For example, a project we're supporting in Zimbabwe on edible insects that has had real implications even on ministry level. So it's a model that works well. And this has been published last year, the first version of this model in the Global Food Security Journal. So I'm happy to read that if you're interested. In our program, we have sort of tried to identify 4 challenges that we believe are important for contributing to this transformation of the agricultural system. And you can see these 4 challenges here. And, they are extremely broad, all of them. They could cover everything in the agricultural system. So each of them has gone through a thorough process, different workshops and discussions with our international board members and other experts, trying to really frame them and to make sure that they focus on the right thing in order for the program to meet the goal. And it's a lot about policies in all of these. So lastly, I would like to give an example of a very interesting project that we're supporting in Uganda together with the Chombogo University in Kampala. There's a group there led by Dr. Judith Nagasha. She's an expert in social science and in gender. And her project is on integrating gender in livestock value chains. And this project is conducted in the western part of Uganda in the Kuruhura district in 4 or 5 different sub-counties. And the aim is to empower women to produce self-milk products through value addition and thereby increasing household income. And this was quite challenging in the very beginning because this is an area where this culturally very patriarchal society where women are not allowed to own resources, they are not allowed to own land, they are not allowed to own livestock, for example. So the men initially, they were not convinced and they were not really happy about this project that was targeting their women. The project team had to do a lot of work on the ground to ensure and convince them that the project aligned with the local culture. And I think that's very important. We come as researchers to really adapt the work we're doing to the local context. And in the end, these women, they were trained by the Ugandan Industrial Research Institute in milk value addition, how to make yogurt, how to make cream, how to make ice cream, how to make lotion and other high value outputs from this milk. And now back in the local communities, we can see that they already started production of yogurt, lotion and other products, thereby a good example on increasing value of these livestock products and has generated income for families. And interestingly enough, now the men becomes interested to join. So they also want to take part in these trainings. So when it comes to increased income, the women start and then the men became interested in joining. So lastly, this quote is from Honorable Maria Matemba, a former member of the Pan-African Parliament from Uganda. We arranged a seminar together with Chombogo University last year. And she said, we need policy-minded researchers and research-minded policymakers. And by that, I finish my presentation. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Sophia, for this taking it down to earth, so to say. Now we go on with a presentation of research fellow Myron G. Bastos from Stockholm University. No, Swedish University. No, Stockholm Yes, thanks for that correction. But I realized when I present you that you are just one of 5, and you are the only man in that group of presentation.
No, I'm glad things are different nowadays. So let me just see how to pass this, because this seems more challenging than solving the world food. Okay, everyone. So just briefly, my name, Myron Basses Lima. The original presenter for this, I think, would have focused on Africa, but I am Brazilian and will therefore take the chance to give a snapshot on the Amazon more specifically. And I've kept the same title that was originally envisaged, and you might think that I'll just repeat what was said, because it could have gone under this title, but hopefully I will build on it and bring some new dimensions, because the crisis is actually more complicated than what you've seen up to now. So there are multiple crises of the food systems as for the global food system as it is. Probably you're familiar with those various dimensions there. And if we are to move onto the face that they have had in the Amazon, one element when it comes to the climate crisis is deforestation. About 3/4 of Brazilian emissions happen to come from land use change. It's actually something more relevant than fossil fuel burning in that context. Globally, 90 to 99% of deforestation comes from, tropical deforestation comes from agriculture. Not all of it gets to be used by for food production, but it includes land grabbing, all sorts of businesses that in practice are auxiliary to agribusiness expansion. So do not think of land grabbing and that nasty stuff as some stuff that is just happening together. Frequently, it's the same actors, the same economic processes. It's the way to legalize lands that happen to be public and so forth. It's a system that is there, and it's basically eating up the world's most iconic terrestrial ecosystem, while bringing us to a tipping point that you may have heard of, and which is something to look forward to, which is an occasion when the rainy season will be so short in the Amazon that simply there won't be water enough to maintain that lush rainforest, and therefore a dieback process begins, and the system hits a biophysical bifurcation point where it is likely to become a much drier place with implications on the global climate. And that is chiefly because of agribusiness. It's chiefly because of the system we have in place that has been focused on cattle ranching, beef exports, beef consumption within Brazil, and soy and corn double cropping that has exploded in South America to the point that some traders call it the soy republic of South America, because similar dynamics have been happening in Paraguay and Argentina. So this is how the Amazon has been at the interface between the global food system and a climate crisis that may be just about to get wickedly worse. Of course, there is a question about biodiversity, and I cannot speak about the food system without speaking about fake diversity, which is what we have in most supermarkets, especially in advanced industrialized countries. It's not, and I think it's very important that everybody leaves this room or the virtual room with this fully in mind. The problems of the global food system are not limited to those billion food insecure people, probably none of which is watching us today. It's including us and how we as a consumer population have grown accustomed to that food, that fake food diversity that basically is based on a handful of species that we've grown used to, and that are combined artificially with all sorts of colorings and flavorings to give us the impression of diversity, while the actual biodiversity, including agrobiodiversity, is heavily neglected. That quote on the second bullet point, they're only interested in soy, is actually from a South American peasant to a journalist saying, look, we actually grow and produce different things here, but they are being the global consumer public, the people who move global trade, the financial system, the whole crew, is not interested in actually putting money, investing, developing those alternative crops and those thousands of other edible species that we could be looking at. The advanced industrial economies got hooked on things like coffee, chocolate centuries ago and are still focused on that. How interesting it would be if we, as a global population, diversified our tastes into, consuming maybe 1,000 more species from the Amazon and elsewhere, instead of falling prey to fake diversity that is actually eroding our food knowledge and what some researchers call consumer sovereignty, which is our ability to actually distinguish good food from junk food. Many people nowadays don't even know what a proper tomato is supposed to taste like. When I'm at restaurants with people of an older generation, and sometimes they ask the waiter, okay, fish, but which fish? And you get puzzled faces. Try going to a McDonald's and asking what fish goes into the McFish. You're not going to get that answer very likely. Anyway, so we're becoming a dumbed down consumer public over the past decades, partly as a product of this food system and of our neglect of actual biodiversity. And of course, finally, food insecurity persists. You got the global numbers. I get you some pictures from the Amazon, and everybody who is watching us today that is a Brazilian has probably seen these images in the last few days because they are doing the rounds this month. This is from this month. Now with the new Brazilian government, there's been a health team that's been dispatched to see the situation of the Yanomami people in what's Brazil's largest indigenous territory. It's about the size of Portugal in the Amazon. And that's the situation. You see those kids, they're all suffering from chronic undernourishment, even though we are the second largest food exporting country. This is not, again, India in the 40s, Ethiopia in the 80s. It's Brazil in 2023. And I point out because we are a large food producer that's been increasing its output of food, a moderately wealthy country, but with huge inequalities that are also in the food system and enhanced by the food system as it is. This is not simply a health issue. It's also an issue of a food system and of a food culture, of food economics, food policy that are definitely not listening to those global pieces of advice, and definitely too focused on certain types of agriculture while neglecting, in the case of Brazil, over 30 million people, and not just as consumers. Those indigenous people, like so many of the indigenous people of the Americas and elsewhere, are actually smallholder farmers. It's just a century-old myth that they're all hunter-gatherers. Actually, so many of the staple foods of the globe have been domesticated by indigenous peoples from the Americas: corn, potatoes, cocoa, and so on. The list is long. But they're not being able to advance that participation as producers of the system because they are being neglected by the way things have advanced. So this is why I think we have to, yes, so that everybody is confident I'll stay in time, but just wrapping up. It's the element of inclusiveness. Again, it's not, I'm not showing those pictures that seem to belong from some dystopian future to say we have hungry people. We heard that already. We have to focus on the inclusiveness of people also as producers, as a way, amongst other things, to diversify what we eat and how that's produced. Thanks.
I will tell you that we are a bit late, but I think Myron did a good work because you don't use all the minutes you got. So thanks for that. So now I will introduce Dr. Anna-Karin Norling, Senior Research Advisor at Swedish International Development Agency, SIDA. Welcome.
Thank you. I don't have a PowerPoint presentation, which has the horrendous side effect that I have to watch myself. Big screen. I should have brought one. Anyway, so thank you so much for inviting me here. I'm really happy to be here from SIDA, our Development Cooperation Agency. I'm a senior research advisor, so I'm working with the research cooperation that SIDA has. And I think it's been so interesting to listen to all the speakers here today. And I want to come back to the science, because we've talked about science-based evidence. And what we are working with is really the science in low-income countries, those countries that are most affected by food insecurity. SIDA works with a strategy from the government where we have 3 results areas. We are contributing to research, to building and strengthening and developing research capacity in low-income countries. We contribute to the production of new knowledge of relevance for poverty alleviation. And we also have a result area about contributing to the impact of research, and that is both in practice and policy and at all levels. And we do this, we work on both national, regional, and global level. And I'll give a couple of examples and also then our why we believe that this is so important. If we start with a global level, we are working, we have been a long-term, Sweden and SIDA has been a long-time supporter of the CGIAR system. And I was thinking about when we talked about, several of you have mentioned the SDG 2, and I'm sitting on the system council there, and we can all agree there, all different donors and stakeholders says, yes, we are here for the SDG 2. But I realize that there are many different ways to achieve that, and that it's a bit of a difference in ideology, actually, because SIDA and Sweden firmly believe that to reach that goal, we need also to reach SDG 1, 5, 8, 13, 15, actually all of them. They are so completely dependent on each other. So we are maybe a small voice, but I think we have a lot of clout. So we try to push for gender equality and equal partnership on that global level. Because we have an experience that is quite unique, and that's on the other side of that scale between global and national, and that is that we have this bilateral research cooperation where we are working together with countries, and at the moment we have 6 countries, and trying to, in cooperation with them, strengthen the whole research system in a country. Because we truly believe that every country needs its own knowledge system, and also, of course, then innovation system. And you have to have that system all the way from primary education through PhD, and then the research and knowledge production. Because to be able to both, for countries to both be able to formulate their own issues, the challenges, the problems, and also to find the solutions to them. And I really took down what you said, Professor Klapper, that the global system is going from globally applicable to context specific. And that is so important, because you also need the context specific knowledge and science, of course. So the national research system is needed to both be able to import knowledge produced elsewhere, so that you can implement that in your context, your local context, but also that what knowledge you gain in your country can be translated up into the global level. And we have, it's our experience that when we support a university, when we work together with a country, we always start with one research university, trying to to make sure that the staff there has a PhD. That's where we begin. To make sure the procurement systems and research management systems and research strategies are there. Because there are so many brilliant researchers all around the world, in every country of the world, but the possibility of doing research is often not there. And then, of course, it's often about management and administration and stuff like that. Also, we see that this is a very long-term endeavor, because when you have a PhD, you don't always stay at the university. You will go to government, you will go to industry, you will go elsewhere. And that is actually not a bad thing, because a country also need high educated people among policymakers, in civil society. If you have to understand science to be able to make the connection into policy and to apply it. So this takes time. And we are there for a long time. That's kind of our and as an example of that, SIDA is governed by strategies decided by the government, and most of them are 5 years, but the research strategy is actually 7 years, taking that into account. So I'm not going to be any longer than that. I just want to say in conclusion that we believe that it's really important with a system approach when it comes to this, ownership. And when I started talking about the CGIAR, the ownership of national agricultural research system, the researchers and their capacity to work together with a global system like CGIAR to translate the research into innovation and local solutions, partnerships, and something we haven't talked about today, I'm just going to say the words, but because they are so extremely important, academic freedom. That's included in all this, but you talked about inclusiveness, transparency, accountability, and so. So yes, I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Anna-Karin, for this. And I think we have seen a very interesting group of combinations of presentations here after Jennifer's presentation. In the schedule, we now have a break, and I have decided we are a bit late, so I have decided that we take it down to just 5 minutes, just stretch our legs, walk through the library and back, open the windows, take in some fresh air. But I have 2 other questions which I will ask you first. That is just a question. Is it okay if we can put the recorded version of the seminar online after the seminar? If someone has an objection, you can tell us that now, and we will don't do it. Otherwise, we will do that. And I can see no one on that. And the other thing is that I had decided that we actually start with the questions after the break from Zoom, because they cannot take part of the mingle in the end. And the group which are here, they can continue to talk for the whole evening on these topics. So we take a 5 minutes break now.
Specialist on food and agriculture and food security at SIDA. And she's very happy for your lecture and very grateful for the additional fifth and sixth dimension of food security and the agroecology principles. The HLP reports are very useful for us. Thank you. My question is, given the global food crisis 2019 to 23 and difficulties for member states in October 2022 due to geopolitics, what further reforms are needed in CFS? In particular, reforms to motivate state actors and big ag food industry actors to align with the principles, consultative and transparency of TRACE, the agency, sustainability dimension of food security, and the 13 principles of agroecology. Yeah, that is a nice question. That is long and big. Okay, should I bring them all up, Anders?
No, take one now.
Yeah, that's one. Yeah, okay. I can read other ones, but we have more on the Zoom. We have from Unos Svedin, and
we have. But we need to. I think we need to take them one by one. Or what is...
Yeah, no. But I'm just saying. So, are we? Do you want me to read them all? That's just to clarify.
Now or no? I don't think we can.
No. So we have the first one from Elizabeth. Good, but keep on sending in your questions. Very nice. We will pick them up. Yeah, that's one.
Or should we bring in Elizabeth? Or...
No, I put the questions. So what are the radical changes to CFS needed to all these challenges? That's probably the question. But it was embedded in a lot of words. So, exactly. So how do we need to, everything you talked about, what is now needed from CFS?
That's how that works. Okay. Yeah, that's a huge question. And as a professor, I'm not sure that I have the full picture of the internal politics of the CFS and what reforms are likely. But I think definitely there are some things that can happen to make CFS work more smoothly than it has maybe in the recent past in the context of these crises. I think there should be some sort of framework. It might involve a policy product that would need to be negotiated, of course, but some kind of framework to go to when crises happen so that we don't get stuck in gridlock like we're in right now. So if we had a pre-agreed framework for the kinds of steps that need to be taken and that states can say, yep, I signed on to that. Of course, we need to have better policy convergence to deal with the specifics, because every food crisis it has its own unique dynamics. But of course, if we look back at the last three food crises, the 70s, the 2008-9, and today, there are some actual common elements, right? We saw oil prices, high commodity prices, claims that speculation is happening on financial markets, disrupted supply chains. All of these things are common to those various crises, and it's likely, given the interconnectedness of the world, the expansion of the industrial model, as was already discussed by Matilda, that if we had a pre-agreed framework for how CFS deals with these crises, I think that would be really helpful. But of course, that's not going to be the most urgent thing when 5 years from now. So getting governments to agree to it is difficult. But that's one thing that I think could really be important. Another kind of change that I think would really be helpful, I'm speaking sort of self-interested from the high-level panel of experts perspective, is a bit more autonomy from the expert panel to be able to make a comment or an analysis of what is happening at any given time. At the moment, we have to basically be requested by CFS to do something. And if CFS can't agree with itself, it's certainly not going to ask us to chime in. But having the ability of experts to be able to chime in and respond to the world situation, even if not asked by governments, I think would be really important. And that's a bit of a difference between, say, the IPCC or the IPBES. They're connected to these intergovernmental processes, but they're not as under their thumb, so to speak. And so giving that kind of autonomy, I think, would be really useful and important. I think, and finally, one more thing that I think CFS really needs is more processes and procedures to ensure that there's follow-up really on the policy recommendations. CFS is constantly making policy recommendations, often based on HLPE reports, but they're voluntary and governments can take them up as they wish. And they often do. They take them home and use them as was discussed more in the domestic context, as Anna Corinne was talking about. But and also Sophia. But I think a more what's the word I'm looking for? And I apologize, it's probably jet lag here. but a normalized process of reporting on how those recommendations were taken up, and if possible, like evidence of how it worked. Because we're constantly, CFS is constantly making policy recommendations, but we don't know always how did that play out on the ground in specific countries. If there was a regular reporting and monitoring system, we would have that information. It would improve the science, and it would also improve the policy making, because then we would know what worked where, when, and why. And we're at the moment lacking some of that information, and that lack of information can create more space for debate and tension. Evidence shines a light on these things, and I think that would be useful. So those are just some beginning ideas of, I think, what CFS could do better.
Yes, thank you. You want more questions? Okay. So here's one question from Uno Svedin. Thanks so very much for the informative keynote talk. So he wants to know, when listening to all the facets of a contemporary system has to do with how its transformative processes are secured in the interplay of advisory system and the policy governance system. The questions relate to the organizational structure, the content of the focus, and the openness of the widening of the new types of contributors. I think that was most a statement, not a question, maybe. So thank you, Uno, for being with us and posting that statement. And I think, okay. And over to you. But we can take it later. So we have to go and shoot.
I don't know. Is it any answer to this comment, or is it just a comment, or should we continue? Maybe we should open up here in the room if there is any comment on the comments here. Louise, yes, please take your microphone. Yeah. Otherwise, they don't hear you online.
Tack. Louise Tegerstad, Stockholm Resilience Center. Thanks so much, Jennifer. I was curious, you comment about agroecology and that all the big organizations, IPCC, IPBES, and you have recommended it. How do you see, since you worked a lot on the concentration of businesses and corporations, could you reflect anything around, like, do you see there's any take-up, or is there resistance, and what would be the policy actions to get it happening? And I guess, considering that, to my knowledge, agroecology builds a lot on the local context, and how does that go with the not so local system of current big scale production? Thank you. Should I go ahead?
Yes, please.
Okay. Thank you, Louise, for that question, and it is a big question, and an extremely important one. Just to say on the agroecology policy guidance that the CFS agreed to, civil society has been kind of critical of it, because they feel that those principles have been watered down to a great extent, that it's not as meaningful as they would like to see it. And there has obviously been, there is sort of like in the air, subtle comments about, needing, that I hear at CFS, like needing to avoid single solutions and this kind of thing. So there is some pushback against the idea of agroecology coming from some big exporting countries, coming from industry, because they see agroecology as somewhat of a threat to their own interests. But also at the same time, there's concern, like IPES Food published a report recently, Smoke and Mirrors, I think it's called. I wasn't part of that report, but it was looking at the ways in which agroecology in many ways has been, there's been attempts to co-opt it by powerful players as well, and to sort of transform it into something that they can use to sort of get on the bandwagon of what's interesting about agroecology, but again, concerns that it could be distorting the meaning that some people have given to it. But just to reflect on what you said, it is true that agroecological practices are unique to different locations because there are different ecosystem conditions and societal organization and et cetera. So that's why the HLP report, focuses on these big principles, because the way that they're implemented is different in different places. But it's widely seen as mentioned, and as I mentioned as well, it's mentioned in an IPCC report chapter on food systems. It's mentioned in IPBES report as protective of biodiversity, and then there's an entire HLP report on it. I didn't want to give the impression that the IPCC and IPBES have done full reports on agroecology, but at least they acknowledge it and mention it. And I think that there's a potential place there for policy, sort of science advice convergence, as well as uptake in policy. But I think it's actually a really very important idea, and and set of principles. And there's a whole coalition that came out of the UN Food System Summit on agroecology, which involves a lot of players, some states, civil society groups, and others. But what's I guess worrying me as a sort of a social, like my own research is mostly on corporate concentration and power in food systems, is that the part of the reason that there's some pushback by big corporations against that idea is it's not always clear, that they're going to profit from it. So I know Matilda was talking about some of the ecological problems associated with industrial agriculture and, modified seeds and machinery and synthetic fertilizers and all that. Those are all commodities that make money for big companies, whereas agroecology is often about organizing agriculture in ways that don't require those kind of external inputs. And so I think it's really important that states get behind understanding it and provide research funding for it, because at the moment we've kind of let big corporations run a lot of the research agenda as far as innovation goes in agriculture. The state has historically played a strong role, but stepped back in the last 30 years or so, and it needs to step back into that space and provide more research support to understand how agroecology really can help improve production, but it also plays a role in providing more agency for participants in food systems, and sustainability, obviously. And those, as I said, are really important dimensions of food security that we haven't paid enough attention to. And I think there's a lot of potential there. Anyway, I'll stop there, but thank you. Thank you for the question.
I think Myron has a small question.
Yes, I do.
On this topic.
Yes.
And then we take another one from Zoom.
It's related and builds on it, because a lot of this discussion reminds me of some of the discussions we had 15 years ago when I was in Waterloo on these topics. And a question to you is, because a lot to me seems the same. Some of the institutional space changed. Back then, we spoke a lot of the WTO, Doha round and stuff. Now we speak of the SDGs and we have these new bodies. So definitely the institutional space probably became more complex. I think the financialization of agriculture is another level of complexity that has worsened, if I can say it so. Things have gotten even messier, while the reality of food insecurity changed little or worsened, as we saw on the graph. In these past decades, where have there been advances in your assessment? You've been involved with this for a while. Where are we winning? What's happened for the better? That gives us hope that, in 2030, we won't just be acknowledging yet persistent problem with the global food system.
He said it with his mouth.
Yes, just to say, Myron sat in on, I think you audited that course, or a grad student, and he sat in on my course on food systems. I think the first time I ever taught it at Waterloo,
That's right.
Many years ago. and always had great conversations. So thank you for that impossibly huge question. And also for calling me out, because I, as a researcher, I spend a lot of my time analyzing what's wrong. And you're asking me where have things gone right? And it's, yeah, it's a tough question because the situation has gotten worse with respect to global food security broadly. And I should state that even that diagram that I showed, the trend where things are getting worse, that the FAO itself changed its methodology of how it counted the hungry around 2013, 2014, where actually they made it look like a better trend line, and it's still getting worse. So if they had saved their old methodology, it would look even worse than it does now, which is unfortunate. But where have things gotten better? I think I've actually been quite inspired by the reform of the CFS that has brought a progressive discussion of these food security issues forward, where we're actually talking about it in the policy context. So that reform happened in 2009, and I think it's changed the dynamic of the CFS. It's brought in more, like it's brought in civil society and the private sector mechanism into that space to discuss policy in a constructive way, even though it's kind of like a bit of gridlock right now. I think that it's actually moved things forward where certain ideas are, it's partly the ideas can be progressive because they're not mandatory. They're not required, it's voluntary, but it does create some space for some progressive discussion. And in that progressive space, we are now talking at the global level about agroecology. Whereas if we hadn't had that reform, we might not even be discussing that. So sometimes it's hard to know where those, where the progress is. But I think having those discussions, the normative discussions, the normative steps are the first ones that precede bigger changes. So I think that's important. And I think bringing in sustainability, questions of agency and equity are also issues that were not as discussed back in 2000. When was that? 2008. There we go. Those issues weren't as prominent in the policy discussions. So I think we are seeing some progress that we're having these discussions. That gives me hope, even though I do spend a lot of time analyzing where the problems are. I'd like to think that we're inching towards a better understanding of these issues. It's just the matter for me of getting past the politics. But I think there are good ideas out there. So I hope that satisfies you. Thank you.
My appetite.
Yes.
Now I have many people in the room who wants to have the word. Is it on this topic? It is. So then we have Anna-Karin.
Sorry, I got so excited. It's a bit of a comment, but also a bit of a question, because as I mentioned when I was talking, CGIAR is one of the major research consortia that looks at smallholder farmers and smallholder farming and doing research on that. And there's many differences in ideology among the donors. There are 15 different countries and all big organizations, philanthropists that are donors. And agroecology is one of those, really, because it's such a controversial subject that, and to me, I'm a bit surprised over that, because from a sales perspective, we don't say one way should be better than the other, but we're looking always at including people who live in poverty, looking at rights perspective and biodiversity, the whole system of it. And even among the European donors, agroecology is really controversial. And at our bilateral corporations, when we talk with researchers in countries at that national level, they usually look at from the perspective of resilience. So they don't see higher production as being something that really needs to be done, but resilience. So how can we, do you think that there will be or how do we go about to get the perspective of the people who who really needs the food, if I put it in simple terms, up on to those global levels? How do we include, maybe we can't point fingers, but include also the big corporations so they understand this? That's also very difficult question, of course, but I think it's a challenge that we need to solve. Thank you.
Did you want to collect a few comments on that point first? Yeah.
Or maybe, Anna, or do you want similar? We take two. Yeah.
Yes, sorry. I participated, the FAO Latin America had this process, report writing about agroecology in Uruguay, because Uruguay is actually the first country in the world who took a national law in agroecology. And it was the kind of civil society that brought this issue, and it was very politicized. But then when it became law, the law was very swampy, and we had a lot of lawyers in there and so on. And the big companies, they were like, oh, but this perhaps we could find a way. First, they were a little bit afraid, but they were like, yeah, but this could perhaps open access to new, better paid markets, blah, blah, blah. And it was very much a process of co-option. The civil society groups actually left the process after a while, after having worked for this for years and, managed this to become law. And also, the FAO asked us as a group of researchers to go into this and try to be a little bit stricter on also how they could implement this from the state actors and so on. But also I found that also the principles of FAO was also quite swampy and not so easy to kind of hold by the hand. So my question is a little bit on that point.
Right. Yeah, I wasn't sure what the question was exactly.
The definitions and how much, with the power dimension, which is most of the time the thing that is the most conflictive.
Yes.
And whether kind of big firms can just not use pesticides, also conflicted with the big companies, but at least big domestic groups can gain from saying, well, we don't use pesticides, blah, 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 but we can access expensive organic markets. So they can buy into that.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and it's a point that I think that some agribusiness, like traders and marketers, are more interested than, say, the input makers, that sort of thing. So there's probably even differences among industry about the reception to agroecology. I think part of, coming back to the other question as well, like part of, I think some of the pushback against it is, and civil society is very clear, and scholars of agroecology are clear. And I should say that I'm not like a scientist that works on agroecology specifically. I'm more on the sort of policy and governance end of things, but they are very clear that agroecology is a science, but it's also a set of practices, and it's also a social movement. And I think the social movement part of it kind of scares some policymakers and business types because it has some explicit goals. But it's important to think about that social movement side of it, that what they're really pressing, my understanding, is more the rights, like bringing in the right to food, the right to have agency, the right to have a say. Many agroecology projects are really built in that sort of participant process, like Anna was asking about, bringing the voices of the marginalized in, because agroecology projects, from what I understand in different parts of the world, are very much based on what are the needs of the community, having their engagement in governance processes, and being part of designing an agroecological system. So it's seen to be serving multiple needs. I guess one of the, come back to that point I made earlier about sometimes hearing about being aware of single solutions. Sometimes agroecology is often presented as the solution to everything. And of course, we have to be careful about that as well, because there are, there's lots of different ways it can be implemented and interpreted, as Matilda was just saying. Parts of it might be co-opted, other parts might not be, but also we need to be sure that we have, that we do prioritize rights and equity through specific policies in that respect, as well as dealing with the sustainability issues. And agroecology can obviously speak to those different kinds of goals, but we need to make sure that there's strong policies in place to address the principles that we need of equity, agency, sustainability, as opposed to just saying, oh, agroecology is going to solve everything. Yeah, because of those reasons. But yeah, I'm interested to hear that you said that it's swampy, because oftentimes when we talk in principles and ideas, it sounds very rosy, but then when you get into the details, it gets a bit muddy and political, for sure. Anyway, those are, I mean, I'm not sure I have answers to the questions, but those are really great comments. Thanks.
Okay, I think now we have Jakob on the list.
Thank you so much. My name is Jakob from Future.
Oh, sorry. I have both worked with research and also with policy, including FAO. And I'm curious because going back to the theme of today's speech, it's the challenge of making science-based policy recommendations. And from your experience, you've been working in this field and you have a good overview. I liked your speech. I mean, for instance, if you look at climate change, I spoke to a scientist. We don't need more scientists because the policymaker can't say that they don't know about it because we don't need to do more research. It's already there. We can't produce more policy recommendation. It's unnecessary in a way. And a bit the same thing going to the food security and the challenge we have. When under your career, where do you feel that you hit the target or that you see that this is really working? Where are they working? What is the kind of format? What is the kind of messaging? Or where have you seen a good success of transforming science into policy and going to changing the paradigm or to the general overview? I mean, like now we had agriculture app, and we also had from the Brazil experience where you see this extreme challenges, despite the food is there, but it's not still the problem is there. So I'm a bit curious to hear a little bit, and it's also referred to what you spoke about, Sophia. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm not. So it sounded a bit like Myron's question to me. Is that sort of? But you're asking about the policy process. Where has been the success? Yeah.
Because information is there. Where you see it? How are you seeing timing and a good charismatic person that mentally, I mean, that's two good aspects, sure, but others.
Yeah. Well, I think we're still like, you're absolutely right. And I think a lot about these comparisons between climate change and food security and biodiversity and in these different processes. Because you're right, we have a lot of science, right? And even the high level panel, its job isn't to do new science. Its job is to interpret the existing science, just like the IPCC does as well for climate. And it's to translate that science into how do we address it, with policy. I think, yeah, I would say what's interesting to me is that food policy science discussions tend to be really contentious. And I think that's why I had the slide about, well, as Matilda said, in very simple terms, food's different. It serves all these different functions in society. And I think that's part of the reason why we have these disagreements. So if you remember the ISTAD process that took place, when was that, 2007 to 9-ish period, which completely fell apart. They produced a really excellent report. It's about this thick. And then civil society and business were involved. I think there were 400 experts involved or more writing that report. And then they had this big clash and everything fell apart and some governments walked away from it. I think I had a student working on science policy interfaces, and she told me they didn't just disband that secretariat, they actually destroyed all the records. I know. Terrible for PhD students trying to understand why that process fell apart. So it is really a contentious policy space. So for me, I guess what I find inspiring is, despite some of these like big problems, there are still formal processes through the CFS for policy convergence. And at least having those discussions is progress, even if it leads to sort of uneven outcomes and that sort of thing. So I think I mentioned already, I think part of the the success is the normative success in getting the ideas on the table. But we still have certain governments with certain interests who don't necessarily want to agree with the idea of the right to food, or they don't want to agree with the idea that maybe we shouldn't be focused just on production and trade, but instead focus on equity and agency and sustainability. Those disagreements still exist, and they're very tied to economic interests. Yeah, I'm not sure if I have like a really good answer to the question, other than I'm glad we're having this conversation.
I mean, like, for instance, if you go to the broader public, not in this room and or on Zoom, I mean, it's still, I don't think that the the food crisis is something that it has been due to the war, actually. Then it's come up and speak about it, that is a big issue. But apart from that, I think it's been pretty hidden compared to the climate, for instance. It's not seen. And I think there's some big challenge in there in just transferring the knowledge of the science and other communities to really come to the action and to the broader attention, sort of.
Yeah, and I think part of that is, I mean, people are obviously experiencing food price inflation right now, and it's making a difference to their pocketbooks and their wallets, and so people are understanding that. But you're right that the pictures Myron showed us of the Yanomami and just the level of hunger, that's not the reality of people every day. And so, and I hadn't seen those pictures yet, Myron. Thank you for showing them. But you're right, people aren't necessarily tuned in to what's happening to other people, whereas the climate stuff might be more, like this is affecting everything. The food system is affecting everything too. It really is. But we need to do a better job of drawing those linkages and having these conversations so that people can be made more aware of it. Like, it's because the climate system, the biodiversity system, and the food system are so enmeshed with one another. And the problems of biodiversity laws, a huge, enormous part of it is agrobiodiversity laws because of industrial production methods. Huge part of climate is, as Myron was saying, land use change driven by agriculture and agribusiness. So we need to do a better job of making those linkages so that people understand it. And I do think that compared to 15 years ago when I taught a course on food issues, and it was kind of a new thing to have a course on food issues, and now it's a normal thing. And we're having more of these conversations with young people, and I think that's great because it's changing ideas and norms on a broader scale, but it takes time. I don't know, but others probably want to chime in on that question too, because I think it's really important.
I can tell you now, we have 2 minutes left, and I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 person on the list. I think we can run over some minutes. Can we do that? Is it okay for everyone? Yeah, I think we can continue. If there is someone now who wants really to have another question, you can tell me and I'll put you on the list, and then it's finished. You will have one more. I put you here on the list.
Sure. It was more to the answer than another question. I don't have another question.
Okay. I think we continue with what I have here now. Then we have Maria.
I can make your life a bit easier because Jakob already touched upon. I was going to go into the kind of citizens boosting opinion, translating policy to the knowledge of citizens, and how that can contribute when policymakers get stuck in the politics. But since you already touched upon that, we can let that go.
Okay.
Let somebody else ask a question. Thank you.
We saved 2 minutes. Now I think we have you. And then we have one after that, we have one online, and then we have you. Yeah.
So I can build a bit on that
Please
as well. Yes, Martin Persson, I'm a researcher at Chalmers University of Technology. So I just wanted to pick on, and it relates to this, but what you talked about in the sort of policy research interface, and so you emphasized the protecting the public interest. But I wanted to unpack a bit, like, so what is, because the public interest can be many different things, right? I'm working partly on understanding public acceptance to policies for more sustainable food consumption, like meat taxes and things like that. And there's, of course, big opposition against that. We had an election here last fall where high fuel prices was a big thing. despite climate change and so on. So, and there's more fundamental issues around, who do you include in the public? Is it just humans, or is it other sentient animals? Is it even nature and so on? So that's fundamental value questions. And I may have misunderstood you, but it sounded like you wanted sort of us as researchers or scientists to speak with like one voice, but I'm not sure we can or even should. So I've been interested in your reflections on that, and also your experience with trying to walking that line in these contentious sort of policy space, like and balancing it, science and values and so on. Big question again, but
Yeah, go on. We have. Yeah.
Yes, thank you for that question. You're absolutely right that it's a bit fuzzy. What does that mean? But what I was emphasizing in the talk was more that we need to make sure that scientists and experts are not being mouthpieces for specific interests, like, industry, or, the livestock industry, or the pesticide industry, or whatever. So thinking more about the
but not even
interest.
like nature, like
right.
Speaking for the trees, like isn't that okay if some as long as you're open about it?
Yeah, exactly. Which ties into the other principle of being open and transparent when it comes to disagreements and debates. But you're absolutely right that there are different ways to interpret what is the public interest, and non-human species, do they have as much voice as human species, or whatever, presence in policy making? And those are, as I loved your word, what was it, muddy or swampy? It's a swampy area because we don't really know how exactly we fulfill that. But I think the importance is to have the discussion, and just to speak from experience in the high-level panel of experts, it is actually part of our mandate is to consider the impacts on those most affected by hunger and undernutrition. So we really work hard to make sure that the interests of those with the least voice, are taken into account. And that's why we do the consultation processes, to better understand those lived experiences. And so we're trying to make sure that makes its way in. And so I guess in a muddy way, I consider that being like following the public interest, as opposed to sort of say a corporate or financial interest. But you're absolutely right that it's a really interesting philosophical question, and there's lots of, and I'm sure that's partly, there's lots of areas to maneuver in what is the public interest, and that might be why, sometimes people, they might not like what the HLPE does because they disagree with it, because they have a different idea of what is the public interest. So it's a good, fair point. Thank you.
Okay, now we have one online.
We have a question here from one in the audience, Katarina Eriksson from Tetra Laval, representing the private sector, and her question is directed to Sofia, actually. Okay. Sofia, we know that science is needed to improve food system, but it's not only or just about food production, but also improving and changing business models so that food actually reaches consumers and there are incentives for producers to engage in food production. Is this kind of science also part of AgriFood? Or is it next phase?
Thank you for a comment, a very, very relevant comment. Yeah, I could talk about this program and what we do for much longer than these 10 minutes, but definitely it's not just about producing food, it's also about the value chains, the marketing and sale and inclusivity, and all that is included in many of the projects that we are supporting. Some definitely targets how to increase market access, how to find new distribution sources and things like that. So yeah, thank you for having me to clarify that. That's definitely true. Thank you.
Okay, now we have the last one.
Thank you, Mats Åberg from SIDA. And this has been a very interesting discussion, big and small, left and right, etc. I've got one question that has been touched upon by some others. And that relates, I mean, the title of this seminar is how to making science-based policy recommendation. Then you mentioned, Jennifer, that there wasn't any good follow-up system on, for example, the CFS, on the recommendations coming out, what trickles out in the countries, and even more importantly, what trickles down to the ground. And of course, that would be very good to have that knowledge, because that's would be part of an answer related to what knowledge do we have and what knowledge do we need, i.e., is it a sufficient knowledge existing that there is a sufficient consensus behind to tell a farmer, small or bigger, that this is the best possible way to achieve a sustainable, resilient production, sustainable in all its aspects. And then, of course, then we need agri-forces, etc., to bring that knowledge out into the reality. That's my question. A quick comment. I think even in a group like this, we kind of having a too strong separation between the SDG 1 and SDG 2. We saw your horrifying pictures from Brazil, and I mean, a poor person can often be hungry if he or she doesn't produce the food themselves, whilst a rich person is never food insecure. So it's a matter of distribution, which is even a more difficult problem, because I mean, it's said by many, there isn't a issue of lack of production. We have enough. It's a matter of distribution between countries, between people. Thanks.
Thank you. I appreciate your comment, and it was really making me think about, as I said, my bigger research world of what I think about around food systems. And I think definitely distribution is a big issue, and we need to pay more attention to it. And we need that information on the ground about how to make systems more sustainable. But I think we also sometimes forget, and maybe this is a conversation, it doesn't happen in places like the CFS because it threatens the interests of a lot of players. But I know Matilda is like a historian as well, and I'm doing a historical project right now, but it's really interesting to think about the last 200 years, and the food system we have today is very much a product of certain, it's sort of like the Industrial Revolution brings us industrial agricultural production methods. It brought a demand for food to be traded globally around the world. And so then we see certain parts of the world specializing in producing certain crops. I can't remember which person mentioned the fact that, I think it was Myron, most human diets are focused on just 4 like commodity crops, right? This whole system, the whole structure is kind of been constructed in a certain way that is a product of these big economic processes and power dynamics. And then today it's true, the food isn't being distributed like it's being produced. As Matilda showed us, the food has been outstripping population, but it's not getting to the right places. But do we make the decision to keep the structure and all its inequities in place the way it is and just try to redistribute the food within it? Or do we try to change that whole structure in a way that makes it more equitable and gives people more agency and possibly is more sustainable? And moving in that direction, it's scary for people to think about completely transforming systems, but I think we really need to think about that. But it's going to involve more than just food policy. It's going to involve economic policy and energy policy and all kinds of policies. And I think like we are having interesting conversations in all kinds of places about climate change, about food systems, about, health systems. And anyway, I'm just sort of riffing off of some of what you said, was like sending, alarm bells off in my head. It was like, it was like huge systemic issue. And I think it's really important for us to be thinking that way in big systems. But also, I agree, and I had mentioned earlier, it would be great to have that sort of mechanism for reporting about how policy recommendations get picked up on the ground and whether it worked or not and whatnot. And there's also just the very real issue of resources. That's actually expensive to do. Asking governments, especially in the developing world, to put resources towards monitoring is probably the last thing they want to do. But if we had that information, it would be really useful. And I think that's where the richer governments can actually provide assistance to poor countries to put those kind of implementation and monitoring systems into place, but also rich countries need to do that monitoring too. Anyway, sorry, that was a long answer to an interesting question, but thank you very much. And I think we should give Myron his chance to.
Do you want to have the last, Myron? I will also say something finally, but
Absolutely. It was chipping into this discussion about what's gone right, how do we make it? And I think it feeds to the science policy discussion. Just two additional things, so I think a lot Jennifer already put there. One is win elections. In Brazil, that's been as vivid as it can be with the changes we've had in the last 10 years and now in the last 30 days. And second, well, apologies. So the first trick is winning elections. Very simple, but critical. It's the truth of it, because no matter what we discuss at the global level, as we implicitly agreed, it will not get materialized at the domestic level unless governments that are willing to pursue that are in place, and they don't just materialize out of thin air. And second is ensuring that these agendas are connected to broader concerns such as economic development. I can say plainly that now we have Lula again as president, as back then in 2008, one coincidence. And back then, these things about local value chain development for alternative food systems was not as strongly there. But now it's been noticed because social movements made it noticed that that agenda is critical for promoting development in sensitive regions such as the Amazon. So now you will hear, anybody who does a quantitative assessment can happily verify that, the frequency with which Lula in his discourses mentioned the word climate, bioeconomy, value chains, social biodiversity has increased, I think, fivefold. And that's because we've made it into the mainstream of that platform. Perhaps these things can be taken home.
I realized that I haven't said anything myself about the topic, so I will actually take the opportunity to summarize this in 3 points. The first, you mentioned this 200-year perspective, and I think we should remember that this academy is actually 200 years old, a little bit more. But what you seldom notice is that this was actually the poorest country in Europe 200 years ago. So the possibility to transform is rather huge. And in this context, you can learn a lot from history. That was the first point. The other point is that you started to say that food is different, Jennifer. But I normally teach my students that farming is different. But how is farming different? It is fixed in space in the era of highly integrated globalized world. And that actually makes sense. And what you can see right now in projects I have been involved in, that's the third point. That is that we actually are on our way to reclaiming locality. Because if you look into regenerative farming, if you look into carbon sequestration, what is ongoing out there right now is that we are adapting agroecological principle, but we don't do it fully because there is a tension there. But even if what is trying to be commercialized as carbon credits, carbon sequestration, that is actually more inside what is going on localities. So I think that can be the final point. Thanks everyone for participating and having questions. And now we have this mingle